there. Thanks for joining us for this, our third session in this grants webinar series that we've been, the Purpose Possible has been doing the month of August. So we've had every Thursday at noon, we've been covering a different topic related to grants. And so far we kind of did a sort of a broad overview, sort of a survey of grants. And then last week we talked a little bit about proposal planning and then looking at prospecting for grants, so finding grants opportunities. And today we're going to talk about sort of the next step, which is, best practices for creating a polished grants proposal. And this could be useful if you're doing this work yourself, or even working with us, like working with a consultant. So we're just going to kind of take you through some of the very critical parts of a grant proposal, and provide some writing tips and some tools that you might find useful. I will say that each of these sections, I mean, you could do a webinar pretty much on each one. So we're just kind of going to dig into kind of surface level, but we are available for questions, and throughout the presentation. If you have comments or anything you want, some more info on, feel free to please pop it into the comments. Audie, do you want to put the presentation up for us? Thank you. So my name's Andrew Jones. I've been with Purpose Possible for about 2 years now, but I've been in the grants field for well over a decade. A lot of my experience has been with healthcare grants, federal grants, and education. But I've kind of had opportunities to work on a lot of different kinds of grants, especially working with Purpose Possible. We work with just a wide array of nonprofit clients. So I've had a chance to get my hands in a lot of things. Unique kind of projects. So Caroline, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. My name is Caroline Egan, and I have been with Purpose Possible for a little over 2 years now. My background is in educational advancement, so most of my clients are in the education and youth development space. But I also work with one affordable housing client and have worked with a few arts organizations. I spend most of my time research and writing grants, so I'm excited about our conversation today. Mary Ellen, I will let you introduce yourself. I think you might be muted.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Sorry about that. I am Mary Ellen Grant, and I've been with Purpose Possible for almost a year and have spent the past 8 years as a grant writer. Prior to being a grant writer, I actually had experience administering an endowment-funded grant program. I've also spent some time being a grant reviewer with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, some DC government agencies, and Humanities DC. My current clients with Purpose Possible are in affordable housing, advocacy, healthcare, and environmental justice.
Great. Thank you both for joining and helping out today. So the session today, we'll start looking kind of, what do you need to do before you jump in to writing, because there's a lot of planning that has to go into every proposal. So we'll look at some steps to take before you actually jump in. Some keys to a successful proposal, kind of some guiding, thoughts as you work on your proposal. Then we'll look at some writing tips and then go through the proposal nuts and bolts, which then translate over into boilerplate, which we recommend. We do a lot of work on boilerplate for our clients so that they can kind of just have everything in one place to make it easy to submit grants. And then we'll look at some tools that might help you with your writing or seeking grants. And then we will have some time at the end for questions And again, if you have questions as we're going through, just don't hesitate to pop them in, and we can either address them as we're going or at the end of the session. So before you start writing, there's a good bit of pre-work that you need to do, and this was touched on in the last session, kind of the sort of like getting your kind of scribbling out your project, sort of thinking about the different elements that you're going to need for your project or your program. So kind of getting organized, and then what we're going to talk about here is kind of like taking that and really, tuning it so that it's a fundable proposal. So planning and then prospecting, so finding the grant opportunity that fits and that you're going to apply for. And those first and second sessions are available for viewing online. So if you want to go back to those, you can find those. So yeah, prospecting and it's something we'll touch on, throughout, but having relationships. So being invited, perhaps by funders too. So what you want to do is, once you've gotten the planning and prospecting, you found your opportunity, you want to take these steps, and we'll switch to this next slide where we'll kind of get into that. So step one is to get buy-in. So you really want to work with your leadership staff, program staff, any kind of external partners, just anyone who really needs to be involved in the project, the program. You need to work with them and make sure that everybody is on board with pursuing a grant, because grant projects, sometimes grant writers get stuck in the corner to just write a grant, but really grants are important group projects. You really need a lot of involvement across the organization. The next thing is to set expectations, which is kind of coincides with getting the buy-in. Is everybody aware of what their roles and responsibilities are, and that goes for even pre and post award. So, what are they going to need to do to put the application together? How are they going to be involved? What information do you need from them? And then who's going to actually do the work and manage data and submit reports and that sort of thing. So you really want to get that set before you even delve into the grant. Creating a calendar is essential. So you really want to. Am I good now? Can you hear me? Okay. So then you want to create a calendar with both your pre-award and your post-award sort of milestones and so that's a good way to do it is to work back from when is a grant due, and then work back from there, and when are we going to have a draft, when are we going to have the budget, that sort of thing. So and one thing that I've run into was actually like people being on PTO that were like the critical person in a grant, like we needed information from them, and they were like in Tahiti, so like really knowing where people, making sure that where everybody's going to be, the important players, and then gathering your materials and drafting your framework. So this goes to the boilerplate that we'll talk about later. Having that information just kind of ready to go, and then creating a framework or a template for how the proposal is going to fit together. And often this will be something that's provided by the. Typically it's something you'll get a template from the funder, which will really guide how you put it together. But kind of figuring out, keeping focused on what you're going to do. Kind of just making sure that all the elements, that there's a through line. So thinking about that as you're starting to draft your proposal. And then something to really take note of, again, it's something that can kind of catch you off guard, is to really note any required attachments. those might need signatures from leadership, or some of them even will need like a notary. So you really want to make sure that you look at those and make sure that somebody is responsible for getting those completed, because that can sabotage a grant if you get to the end and something needed to be notarized, for example. So some keys to a successful proposal, again, really can't overstate the fact that you just really need to plan carefully before writing any grant. Kind of the worst thing is to not plan and then get a grant and then not know, have folks kind of caught flat-footed, not knowing what they're going to do. So there's a recommendation of spending, in terms of your effort that you put onto a grant, 80% planning and then 20% writing. Key to that, the planning portion, is to develop a clear vision for your overall project, and then focus on the impact. And something that can sometimes get lost is, you'll only think about the folks that you're directly serving, but thinking about how a project might be used by other organizations, kind of like what is the broader impact, can really, it can generate some good ideas and also make your proposal more compelling if you could take it and use it somewhere else. Really key thing to think about is that it's not, relationships with funders, grants are not just, we're getting the money, kind of see you later. Like, these are, the funders are really investing in you, investing in your organization, your project, and knowing your strengths, and then being very clear that what the funder is interested in, that you've read their pillars, you've reviewed the guidelines carefully. All of that is really important as you're thinking about getting a proposal put together, and kind of interlocking with that is to demonstrate your credibility and expertise. What makes you stand apart from other organizations, and demonstrating that you really understand your population, you understand the folks that you're serving. And that's the suggestion here. Keep current internal and external qualitative and quantitative data on hand. So if you're a health center, then make sure that your patient data is up to date. But then it's also really important to have things like patient stories, or just kind of like, what is the human impact? Because you're serving people, so having those stories available is really important. And then something I alluded to earlier, in terms of like getting invited to submit a proposal, the proposal is often just a small part of a larger kind of relationship that you're building. And so it's always wonderful to get to that grant submission part of it, but there's you're really partnering with folks. So thinking of it as truly a collaboration will set you up for success. So Mary Ellen, I'll pass it over to you for some writing tips.
Okay, great. So now that we have the planning out of the way, we can almost start writing. And as you're writing a grant proposal, it's like any other writing project in some ways. It's good to start with an outline, and it's good to proofread, and ask a colleague to proofread. With grant applications, you often have to be concise. There's page limits, word limits, even character limits. So starting with an outline will help you focus on what matters most. The other piece of this is consistency matters. Make sure you're using the same numbers and details throughout both your narrative, budget, and any of those additional application attachments. You don't want to turn off the person reviewing your grant due to a key section that's missing, or a typo or a grammatical error, or just plain inconsistencies. 2, use data. Use all the data your organization has access to. Provide specific numbers, examples, and information about your organization's programs and the people it serves. You can also do research on the broader community and cite your sources along the way. We'll talk more about this later. 3, you can also do research on the person who's going to be reviewing your grant. Sometimes this information might be discoverable through a meeting with a funder, and sometimes it's included in the RFP for the grant opportunity. If you don't know, it's best to assume that the person reviewing your grant is not a substantive expert in your field. So avoid using acronyms and jargon without at least first defining them. And be sure to connect your proposal to the funder's mission. You'll want to use language from their grant guidelines and mission statement when describing your proposal. And then this final piece is the biggest advice I give to all my clients. Above everything else, you want to stay true to your organization's mission. Be sure the project you're proposing is meeting your organization's needs above trying to fit it into whatever the funder is requesting in the RFP. And then beyond that, think about how the language you're using throughout your proposal helps tell your story and stays true to your mission. A simple example I like to give on this is a lot of funders describe a population as a target population. I find that I often change this to priority population because target, like much of the strategy terms that we still use, are linked back to military campaigns and evoke violence and gun images. And oftentimes it's not aligned with the mission of the organization I'm writing about. So just some food for thought there. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Caroline and talk about nuts and bolts.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary Ellen. So with all of that in mind, we are going to get into the grant proposal. So the very first section we'll discuss is the overview of your organization. And the purpose of this section is to establish your organization's credibility and qualifications for funding. So you'll want to provide a brief background of your organization, which includes your mission and vision statements, the year you were founded, the population you serve, high-level program overviews, and key strengths and accomplishments that illustrate your organization's success. Make sure to keep this section brief. You want to be concise and specific. The point isn't necessarily to walk the grant maker through the entire history of your organization, but to highlight the growth, accomplishments, and how your organization has evolved to meet the needs of your community. So this is likely the first section that the person reviewing your proposal will read. So it's important to set the tone here and make sure that they feel like yours is a credible organization that they want to partner with. A compelling way to craft this section is through storytelling. So in this example, it's clearly mission-driven and conveys why the after-school program is a vital community need. And not only does this organization help improve math and reading scores, it also provides a safe space for students to learn. So you can see that the program addresses not just an educational need, but also a broader social and emotional need, which makes the program more holistic. And as a reminder, you're showing the grant maker that your programs offer your programs fill a broad need and address a critical problem in the community. So if your organization provides more than one program, you can tailor this overview to focus on the program that you're requesting funding for. So the next section is describing who exactly you serve. So, and this ties into the need statement. Crafting a need statement involves two components. First is describing the condition of your community. So whether your organization focuses on a city, a neighborhood, or an entire region, you'll want to use a variety of specific economic and demographic stats to paint a vivid picture of that community. Some of this data might include the total population, crime statistics, health department data, family composition, income levels, demographic data. As Mary Ellen mentioned, grant makers are not always experts in your field. So go with your gut and choose the data that best illustrates the unique characteristics of the community you serve. And after all, this is baseline information that we'll use to measure progress over time, which we'll discuss later. So here is an example of a description of a priority community. It doesn't need to be overladen with statistics. Just use data that supports your need, but also aligns with the grant maker's priorities. So this example clearly highlights the specific challenges that individuals and families in the West Side neighborhood face. And the economic inequities and high unemployment rate in this community illustrates the urgency and relevancy of why your programs exist. However, it's important to keep in mind that just because your organization might serve a community with the most dire need doesn't necessarily mean that the grant maker will automatically choose to fund your organization. A winning proposal conveys that you have a deep understanding of the community's needs and that you're committed to making a difference. And then a quick writing tip, grant makers like to see evidence in your application that you have read and reread the application guidelines. And one way to do this is to incorporate their language into your application. So just be mindful of the ways that they describe their community and the language that they use about their mission and vision and goals, and lay that into your application. So after you've described the conditions of your community, you'll use this to craft a needs statement about why the community is facing these challenges and needs your services. So I will turn it over to Mary Ellen to discuss how to craft a compelling needs statement.
Thanks. Okay, so while we're talking about need, it's really easy to start describing the issue at hand with dire gloom and doom kind of terms. At this stage, I like recommending to focus instead on the positive. Find a solution-oriented approach to describing the problem in your community, and then directly tie it back to the grant project you're proposing. It's good to look at the problem from a societal and community perspective rather than just the need at your organization's level. This helps the funder tie it to their own priorities. It's also good to emphasize the urgency. Why now? How is this need manifesting in our community that your organization is serving? And then finally, it's good to describe how your organization is well positioned to address this problem. Specifically through this grant and specifically through the project you're proposing. As we've been saying, I feel like we're saying the same thing, but it's also important. You need to do your research, right? This is your opportunity to demonstrate your organization's deep knowledge and expertise with an issue. And you're going to want to use data to back you up, data that's local, relevant, and up to date. It can be quantitative or qualitative. And then you'll also want to cite your sources. And a lot of times funders don't have any guidelines on how sources need to be cited. But it's just important if footnotes are allowed to include that information so that they know where you're pulling it from. And if they don't allow footnotes, you can just simply put the entity you found it from plus the date that it was published. And that's just a marker saying that this is information that comes from this reputable source. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a statement of need. And as we look at this one, which is about healthcare services in rural communities in Appalachia, we're going to look at it in a little bit of a different way. And that is using the needs statement to address the whys of your program. So why should the funder care about your program? And here the needs statement is saying, well, rural healthcare is really scarce. And why your organization. In this need statement, it's saying that this organization is positioned to offer mobile healthcare going directly to those hard to reach patients. What's the urgency? Why now? Healthcare is expensive, particularly when patients prolong care due to inadequate access. This program can help reduce the most expensive type of healthcare spending, which is ER visits. And then why are these funds needed? And that's really, this organization needs the funds to run their mobile healthcare program. So it's all very laid out and straightforward, answering those key why questions. And at the end of it, the funder should go, aha, yes, of course I need to fund this. It aligns with my priorities perfectly. Okay. And with that, we're going to pass it back to Caroline to talk about program overview.
Yes, thank you. So the program overview is the heart of the proposal. So now you have painted a clear picture of who your organization is, who you serve, and what their needs are. It's time to prove to the grant maker that your programs will have the largest impact and provide a solution that serves a broad community need. Your overview should address how your organization has been successful, how you anticipate challenges, who some of your key partners are, and state clear, measurable goals. So you can go to the next slide. So this is an example of a high-level program overview, but grant makers really want to make sure that your program reflects the best practices, is sustainable, has measurable outcomes, and most importantly, aligns with their mission and vision. As Mary Ellen just mentioned, your program must match the funder's priorities. So you can adapt your program descriptions for each application to build a case for why your program is successful and likely to accomplish what you want it to during the time frame which you've outlined. And again, try to incorporate language from the proposal guidelines to ensure your messaging is aligned with the funders. And your program descriptions must prove what you say is true. Funders want to see backup information. So use data, program feedback, awards and recognitions, anecdotes, anything to brag on your organization to support your vision, and just let the facts speak for themselves. So we've made it this far through the presentation without mentioning the budget. However, the budget should inform every component of your program and application narrative. So, Mary Ellen, I will turn it over to you to discuss how to create a budget that supports your proposal.
Thank you. Yeah. First, don't be afraid of budgets. I often find it's easier for clients to start with the full program budget, not necessarily the grant budget, but what would it take your organization to run this program beyond what the grant amount is, right? So if you're looking for a $50,000 grant, but you know it's $350,000 to run this program, that's the budget you want to start with. And then you can adapt it for each grant application. This helps track what portions of the program budget are paid for by other grants. And it can also help plan for cash flow with other grant awards. As we know, grant awards might be awarded on one date and then dispersed throughout the year or over the course of 2 years. So this, by doing it by the full program and tracking where the funds are being spent and when they're coming in, it really ensures that your staff will be employed throughout the duration of the program. And details matter here. So you want to follow the guidelines from the funder. If there are a lot of restrictions from the funder, I think that it's sometimes easier to start with the budget than the narrative. So you have a clear idea of program scope. Sometimes you'll develop a program idea and it will be wonderful. And then you're reading the RFP and discover, oh, I can't include salary. And oh, I can't include indirect. And so that has to affect the scope of what you're offering the funder. And when you're developing the budget, you'll want to get cost estimates, provide detailed calculations, and detailed descriptions of each line item. You might also need to be prepared to include other sources of funding for the program. Some funders want detailed numbers as part of your budget, so an income and expenses section. Others might ask for a list as an attachment or in another section of the application altogether. The biggest piece here is really that the description and the budget need to tell the same story. There can't be any surprises in your budget. So when you're drafting the budget, make sure that it includes everything you're mentioning in your program narrative in some way. If you add materials because you have leftover funds, you have that $200 and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, so you can make it the easy, even 10,000, and you decide, oh, we'll offer gift cards as incentives, but you haven't mentioned that anywhere in your narrative, make sure you put it back in there. And sometimes when grant reviewers see additions that are big or don't make sense, it can call into question the entire budget. It can be a problem. Similarly, skimming grant guidelines and RFP details can call a budget into question. If travel is not an allowable expense, but you've included travel in your budget and it's a very competitive grant, the entire project might get excluded from the get-go because you've included something and they need to just easily be able to cut some of the applications. Lack of specificity or inaccurate cost estimates can also be problematic. If you say you need to buy a new car to deliver goods or something, but you only include $200 for it, someone looking at that budget is going to say, well, that's clearly not enough money. How are they going to deliver on this piece of the budget? And then the last piece that is a common mistake actually happens on the organization side of things, and it's not accounting for enough staff time. Really think through how much staff time it will take to carry out this budget or this program, and incorporate it into that big program budget, and then figure out how to fund it through one grant or various amount of grant awards. Next slide, please. So there's some essential program components. Personnel is obviously a big one. Funders like to see what percentage of an employee's time will go towards the grant project. In the budget narrative or the application narrative, you can outline each personnel's role for the project. Additionally, fringe benefits. If you haven't already, we strongly recommend working with an accountant to determine what your fringe rate is. And then in your budget narrative, you can outline all the wonderful benefits you offer your employees. In terms of non-personnel, make sure you explain the purpose of each line item. Be specific, per item calculations, and make sure they tie back to the goals and outcomes included in your application narrative. Indirect costs. This is often an area capped by funders. Some funders won't even allow it. And if you don't know what your overhead rate is, this is another area you can work with an accountant to determine it. And it's also important to understand what is included in it. Sometimes funders will allow some of the costs included in indirect, but not all of them. So if you understand the breakdown, you can incorporate anything that's possible within your grant budget. And remember, this is the line item that keeps a roof over your organization's head and the lights on. So please, please, please always include it when allowed. Okay, next slide. Here is an example budget narrative. So as you can see here, this is an application that is about a literacy program. And this is, as we go through it, I'll kind of talk through, this is the narrative side of things. And in the budget table or the Excel spreadsheet, you'd want to provide more detail and list it a little differently. So for Jane Doe, you would list her title, the 25% FTE, her base salary, and the cost for the grant. Her specific role would be fully explained in the application narrative. For the teacher's stipends, you'd list the number of stipends, the per stipend amount, and the total for this grant in your Excel spreadsheet. And ideally, the stipend would be fully explained in your application narrative. And then for the education materials, you'd actually create two line items in your Excel spreadsheet. one for the books and the other for the workbooks. Each line item would include the number of books, the item cost, and the grant total. The purpose of these workbooks would actually be outlined in your application narrative and or budget narrative as well. And so this is a short version of a budget narrative. You could go into a lot more detail here, and depending on how much room they give you in the application narrative versus budget narrative, you can kind of play with where those details are going. But the key takeaway is that your program description and budget are in sync. You want to describe exactly how the funds will be used to support the program's goals. Okay, so with that, I will pass it back to Andrew.
Yeah, something that a federal reviewer once told me about the budget was that he felt like a reviewer should be able to just open your proposal and rip the budget out and look at that and kind of know exactly what you're going to do with your project. So that's, having those careful calculations and things like that is really important, and such an important part of keeping, like we've talked about, keeping making sure that you are narrowly focused on what you're going to do. So outcomes and evaluation, this is, also a huge part of any grant program, because, what are you going to do with the funds? What are going to be the changes that occur? What's going to happen if a funder funds your grant? So there's goals and objectives, and a lot of times these are kind of conflated or confused. So goals are kind of the broad, long-term, big picture. This is kind of like what will, and a lot of times these are kind of like, looking down the road. So these aren't as specific. But again, sometimes these are interchangeable, but really that's what goals are. And then objectives are your more, you're focused in on specific changes, and having those be kind of, time bound, and using SMART goals, or the SMARTY framework is a new one that we're seeing a lot, which includes, the standard elements of SMART goals, but then also inclusive and equitable goals. So that's just trying to reach populations that are historically excluded populations and things like that. So so I have seen that. I've been seeing that a bit more from funders. And then of course, with the SMART goal, those are concrete, clearly defined, and so and I think with projects, sometimes folks they think very broadly about what they're going to do, and we actually touched on this in the last week's webinar, thinking about your goals and objectives. So the earlier you think about these, and the better, because it will help as you're developing the entire proposal plan. You do need to be clear about explaining how you're going to actually measure performance. You can say all you want that 90% of the children you serve are going to show better test scores or something like that, but who's going to measure it? How is it going to be measured? And then choosing outcomes that fit your project. And these are kind of like big, kind of your big categories. So behavioral, are there going to be changes? Are folks going to change their behavior that you're serving? Performance, is it going to improve how your organization is providing services? And then process is, you'll see this. I've seen this a lot with like piloting projects, seeing if you can get, is a new approach going to work? And then product, is what's going to result from the outcomes. not a terribly great explanation there, but anyway. So measuring outcomes, there's some key questions, and again, I'll say here too that I've attended, many webinars just about outcomes. So this is a big topic. But as you're thinking through your outcomes, some key questions. What are the most important impacts of your project? So think about economic impacts, social impacts, quality of life impacts. And then what does your organization already collect in terms of data or outcomes? You can really, you can save yourself a lot of time if you, stay consistent across grants. Measure the same kinds of things that will save you time in data collection, and it keeps you from having to manage just so many different kinds of outcomes. And then thinking about the data collection tools that are already available. Surveys are a big way to measure outcomes, and student test scores. With health projects, a lot of times it's showing improvement of like things like BMI or something like that. So how are you tracking the information? And again, using what you already have is the best approach. And then who's responsible for collecting and managing the data? A lot of places or a lot of nonprofits don't have the luxury of having a data manager. So is that going to be your program staff? And again, by using consistent metrics or using things that you're already collecting, especially if you're a small organization, that can really save some headaches for your program staff if they're collecting that data. And then just how many metrics are needed, and how many can you reasonably manage? Typically you'll see funders will request, I think 3 is typically kind of what we'll see. So if if it's not specified, 2 or 3 is usually a pretty good number. And keeping it at that number also helps with being able to track it effectively. So some examples here of outcomes. So a bad outcome or a bad example is students will improve their academic performance and feel better about school, which is just very broad. That's almost more of a goal, and it's not time bound. You don't have any sort of any kind of actual numbers attached to it. There's no quantitative measurements. So then a better example is, the second one where you're explaining the grant period, the percentage of folks who are going to show improved math and reading comprehension scores. So, thinking about your outcomes as, you want to show growth, things like increase, students will perform better, things like that. You just really want to be specific, because again, funders are really investing in these projects, and if your outcomes are very broad, very, just sort of just loose, it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in your project. And something that you'll see a good bit, especially like this example is from the National Science Foundation. You'll see logic models, and these are just graphic representations of your project. So what are the activities? What are the inputs? And then you get into short-term, midterm, and long-term outcomes. So these can be a big headache, but some folks really find them very useful. So there's tons of templates around if if you want to. I mean, these can be a really good way to organize your project and kind of have everything laid out in one place. So this is not. I don't see this a lot with foundations. Maybe with some of the larger, very large foundations. I think I had to do one for the Oak Foundation, but yeah, you'll see these, and they can drive you crazy, but again, they can be pretty helpful too. So the last section we'll touch on here in terms of the nuts and bolts is sustainability, which is a really it can be a really irritating question, because throughout your proposal you're making the case for the funder to support your program or project. So, you're trying to demonstrate that there's need, and that you're going to be able to, reach those outcomes with their funding. But then in this question, your response to this question, you have to also kind of walk the tightrope of, we need the funding, but we're also going to be just fine if we don't get the funding. So, so this one is kind of the bane of the existence of grant writers, and you see it a lot, and you'll see it even with like grants that are $5,000, and it's like, well, that's not really gonna this isn't earth-shattering money for us, but it's something as you're planning your proposal to just get ahead of and think about. So there's some questions that that you might find useful, that might help you in crafting or a compelling and convincing response to this the dreaded sustainability question. So some things just to think about are, if you have a diversified funding stream for your organization or the project or program, that demonstrates to the funder that they're not the only one investing in the project, or because they want to see buy-in from other funders, and they don't want to see that if their funding goes away, the project or the your operations are going to collapse. So another one is to are you taking steps to improve fundraising capacity? So that could be things like working with your board to map out relationships, folks that they could contact for funding. Are you doing things with development staff? Is there things like continuing ed for your development staff, things like that. Relationships are also important. Other funders, other foundation funders, government funders, other nonprofits and community-based organizations, and then if you have local leaders who are interested in supporting you, this could be a good opportunity to demonstrate that you've got partnership opportunities that might lead to collaborative grant programs, or in-kind support for your program. So that just can show that there's you have a broader base of support. Connecting with corporate partners, that's something that some organizations kind of either don't do very well or kind of shy away from. But demonstrating that if you have, like if Google's in your area and you do, kids STEM programming, then you would want to, demonstrate that you've done your due diligence there. Annual special events or fundraisers, if there's if you're bringing in funds from something like that, highlight those. And then communication strategies to reach more donors, so that you demonstrate that you're trying to, again, broaden your base of support. And then and it's earned income. If you have any sources of earned income or potential sources of earned income, it's not every nonprofit it has the has that advantage, but if there are opportunities, this is a great place to highlight them. All right.
Awesome.
Caroline, go ahead.
Alrighty. So if you've learned anything, it's that grant applications are time consuming. So the very first thing that we like to do when we're working with clients is to create a grant boilerplate. And this document serves as a catch-all document that includes all information, text, supplementary materials that you need to complete a grant application. This is very much a living document that should be updated regularly with up-to-date trends and data, your program outcomes, updates on partnerships, and other relevant information that you can repurpose for different applications. So when you get started on your boilerplate, you should have all of your information readily available for reference, and can kind of create a framework based on the sections that we've just outlined. And this document should also link to things like your board list, budgets, 990s, and other common grant application attachments. And now we will just touch on a few tools that our team uses. Two writing tools that I recommend are Grammarly and Hemingway. These are online writing tools that are really helpful for editing and making writing suggestions. They'll catch spelling and grammatical errors, but they'll also help evaluate the tone and suggest ways to improve your writing. And then AI and ChatGPT. These can be great tools for suggesting ideas and phrases, cutting down on word or character limits, and refining text. But always be careful to review your language. AI is helpful, but it's not always accurate, and it certainly doesn't always reflect the language of your organization. I know we are close to time, and I want to make sure we leave room for questions. But with ChatGPT, I think it's important to note that there are some confidentiality and privacy concerns, which, Mary Ellen, if you want to jump in and speak to
I'll
that.
just briefly touch on it. Yeah. So something to consider is that when you're entering something into AI, it becomes part of AI learning, right? So as a nonprofit organization, it's a good idea to think through what you want to feed to AI. Are you okay with your budget information being shared? Do you have research projects in development that you don't want the world to know about yet? A good rule of thumb is that if it's not on your website, you might want to think through if it's ready to go into AI. Additionally, it's important to note some funders are beginning to require disclosure about whether applicants have used AI to develop any of the materials that they're submitting. And one final note, as someone who participates in grant review panels, I can say it can be extremely obvious when an applicant has used AI and not read it through. The AI loves to use a buzzword, and it sometimes creates incomplete sentences that really contain no substance. Here's a recent example I will share with you. needs due to organization's core values and the organization's vision for economic development among low-income families in the District of Columbia. So I'm not sure what that sentence says, but it says a lot of buzzwords. It's not a complete thought, and it should never have gotten through to submission. So just be mindful when you're using it and think through how your organization wants to use it.
Yeah, it can be a very helpful kind of way. I found that it's really good for creating a list of things. So it can be useful, but thinking it could write an entire proposal or draft a clear and compelling letter of support or something like that. You're probably better off not relying on AI for that. So we're just about at time. If anybody has comments, again, pop them into the chat here, or we'll put up our contact information, and you could reach out if you want, if you have any particular questions. And again, this is the penultimate session in this All Things Grants webinar series that we've been doing throughout August. Next week at noon on the 29th, Thursday, we will cover what happens when you do get a grant and what are the steps for effective grants management so that you're able to actually maintain your funding and continue to be able to meet your mission. So, I'm not sure if there's, I haven't been monitoring the comments.
Looks like someone has a question about taxes, and if we don't have time to touch on it here, we will certainly follow up with you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
If you missed a webinar, yes, the recordings are available. So they should be accessible via our website.
Yeah.
And this one will be available. Should be available later this afternoon. Well, reach out. Feel free to reach out to us. Thank you for attending today.